Okay, I've got one for you. Not every American president was born in the United States. It's not a conspiracy. George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, they were the first presidents, the founding fathers, but they weren't born U.S. citizens. They were born British subjects. Until the Declaration of Independence was signed, there was no America for them to be born into. I shouldn't even use quotes, it's a fact. It wasn't until the 8th U.S. president, or Martin Van Buren, became a commander-in-chief that was born a U.S. citizen. Now, in the annals of American history, he is at best forgotten, and he is at worst condemned. If anything, his presidency was quite dubious. His time as the 8th U.S. president, it highlighted one of America's darkest truths. While America's ideals have been easy to proclaim, the nation has struggled with to whom those ideals apply to. Defining citizens from persons, recognizing subjects from savages, is a task that not every leader, particularly the 8th U.S. president, has always been willing to live up to. Now, neither the Declaration of Independence nor the U.S. Constitution immediately defined what it meant to be a citizen. This is true. In the Constitution, the founders left more details on the length of time artists and scientists could own their work, the concept of fair use, than they did on who could be a citizen. In early America, citizenship was primarily determined by birthright within the country, provided the individual was white. This reflected a system that prioritized race and birthplace over other factors for inclusion. Now, Martin Van Buren was granted this privilege, of course, because he was white and he was born in the U.S. But in so doing, his actions, the actions of the 8th U.S. president, elucidate an ironic point. Citizenship by birthright may not inherently instill the values, principles, or cultural norms of a country any more effectively than the experience of an immigrant who chooses to become a citizen. Being born within the U.S. borders may not be sufficient for carrying forth American ideals. In this sense, the overlooked, forgotten, his presidency is highly instructive. His 4-year term reveals that while the founders were very clear about who could not be president of the United States, they were, by many accounts, less certain about what an American should be. Now, if we assume that an American is anyone that enjoys the rights of free speech, an American is anyone that pursues their ideals without interference from their government, an American is anyone with the same rights as anyone else, someone else, no matter their background or their creed. If we assume all of this, then Martin Van Buren may have been the first president born a United States citizen, but the least American of them all. And this is why. There's the first of everything. And this is the story of the first U.S. president to be born a U.S. citizen, and what his presidency taught us about citizenship in early America. I'm Paul Neihart. I'm your host, and we'll get through this one together. So this is the first podcast. Welcome. This is where we celebrate what's first, not because it's best or worst, but because it offers us the chance to reflect on what second, third, and whatever comes after that should be. While at first, the definition of a citizen might have been somewhat opaque in early America, the eligibility for the U.S. president was not. The presidential clause clearly stated that no person except a natural-born citizen or a citizen of the United States at the time of the adoption of this Constitution shall be eligible to the office of the president. This clause is taken directly from Article 2, Section 1, Clause 5, you know that, of the U.S. Constitution. And it has never been changed. It also, in earnest, has never been challenged. In fact, the closest challenge to the presidential clause has been a hypothetical. It involved Arnold Schwarzenegger, the bodybuilder and actor turned U.S. citizen and California governor. Now, many felt, perhaps hoped, that his political reign would not be a disaster film, but in true Arnold fashion, a hero's journey. The man who once famously said, "If it bleeds, we can kill it," well, he ended up having a disastrous approval rating at the end of his tenure as governor. It ended his political career, and all told, it was moot. The Founding Fathers made sure that he, or any person not a natural-born citizen, were ineligible for the U.S. presidency anyway. Of all the villains Arnold had done away with in his films, on a proverbial path to the White House, he would have been faced with the most formidable villain of them all: an act of Congress. Now, the Founding Fathers, as we all know, greatly feared foreign intrusion. Even after the Revolutionary War had been won, leaders within the U.S. assumed the King of England could meddle in the U.S. presidency. He could send a person of foreign influence, a Trojan horse of sorts, to interrupt American affairs. This was their chief concern. Thus, an individual born in the United States would be, presumably, the least susceptible to foreign intervention. Now, calling attention to the Founding Fathers' usage of natural-born highlights how America has wrestled with its identity since its inception. America placed natural-born in the presidential clause, but nowhere else in the Constitution. Again, it placed a greater emphasis on who could run the country than the people it presumably would be running. While the United States knew who it could vote for and who could not be president, it needed a better understanding as to who was allowed to become a citizen. Now, to define this, Congress passed the Naturalization Act of 1790. In this, anyone who swore an oath to support the U.S. Constitution, was in good character, had resided in the U.S. for at least 2 years, would gain citizenship. And, what's more, they had to be white. We can surmise as to why this act included this racial clause: racism in the South, complacency in the North. But consider what this actually meant. Someone could be free, reside in the U.S. for 2 years, swear an oath, and still not be a citizen. This is precisely what thousands of African Americans found themselves in during the passage of this act. They were free. Either they had purchased their freedom or been bought into it, but they weren't allowed to become citizens. In fact, non-whites were not afforded citizenship until another Naturalization Act. This one was aptly dubbed the Naturalization Act of 1868. It removed any reference to a person needing to be white, and all it took was the Civil War, the nation's deadliest war in its history, to accomplish this. Now, while the Naturalization Act has evolved a number of times, the nation tries to understand and correct its wrongs and understand who should and shouldn't be citizens. The presidential clause, again, to this day has not changed. It does not allow a foreign-born individual to become U.S. president. There's no line of secession, there's no loophole, there's nothing around this. Against the backdrop of a revolutionary war and a nation emerging from hostile overlords, that makes sense to value birthright citizenship. But as we will examine in Martin Van Buren's presidency, giving someone the right to American citizenship just by right of soil, it doesn't exactly make them more qualified to fulfill the American dream for others. They, have no allegiance to renounce with a foreign king, but are they lacking context as to what makes one nation, their own, better than another? Thomas Jefferson believed the Constitution belonged to the living and not the dead, and it should be amenable to generational changes. Surely the presidential clause is something that a new generation should consider addressing, maybe the right to citizenship itself. When we examine the legacy of Martin Van Buren, we see the paradox starting to present itself. The 8th U.S. president was born in the U.S. He was the first one to do so, but he was also the first one who didn't speak English as his first language. He was something of a foreigner in his own right. Dutch was his first language. What's more, unlike many of the founders, he was born poor, or at least not well off, in the New York countryside. Once more, he was only one of 2 U.S. presidents in the entire history to not attend college or serve in the military. He was not educated at a university. He didn't attend the military. He didn't even originally speak English, but he was, by definition, the first president of America born an American. Furthermore, and this is where it hits, his presidency was remembered not for the values and ideals that America sees as its pillars, but for the dark side I'd rather forget. For all of his accomplishments, Martin Van Buren created the 2-party system, Democratic Party, kept America away from war with Britain. He's forever remembered still for largely one horrible event, atrocity. Some might be surprised by this. He was born an outsider, he had no political connections or British ancestors. Van Buren could have had a special sympathy for foreigners. He could have helped clarify the path to naturalization for those who wanted the right of citizenship, but were not born in the United States to possess it or be given it. But he, a man who did nothing to earn his citizenship, did not do this. Van Buren instead used his presidential powers to commit that atrocity, to remove an estimated 15,000 Indians from the southeastern United States, roughly 4,000 of which, it is said, died. Van Buren referred to this as a necessity, but history refers to this event as the Trail of Tears. Van Buren, in his own words, said that America needed to be white, that a mixed occupancy of the same territory by the white and red is incompatible with the safety or happiness of either. He also said that they immigrated with an apparent reluctance. A Georgia volunteer who was on the ground held a different view. He said, "I fought through the Civil War and have seen men shot to pieces and slaughtered by the thousands, but the Cherokee removal was the cruelest work I ever knew." In one sense, Van Buren embodied the American dream. He was born with little means, and through determination, he ascended to the presidency. On the other, he refused to expand the imagination as to who could participate in or alongside that dream. He was a man who could have shaped history, but he did not. He could have viewed natives as more than just pesky savages interrupting his presidency, but he did not. He could have used his power to negotiate treaties in good faith as opposed to relocating natives, but he did not. Van Buren failed to see what the Founding Fathers saw. And many of the Founding Fathers were actually inspired by the Native Americans. In their vision of what America could be, they actually looked up to the Iroquois. The Iroquois had a metaphor that said, "Many arrows bound together cannot be broken as easily as one." This thought was thematic with the vision Benjamin Franklin and the forefathers sought in molding the United States. If you need an example, look at the Great Seal. There's the bald eagles holding arrows in its talons. There's 13 of them to be exact, representing the original U.S. colonies. Now, Martin Van Buren didn't see this. It wasn't as romantic as the forefathers regarding the Native Americans. He did not hold the same fondness as Franklin or the founders did. He failed to make any connection between the principles that founded America and the tribes nurturing the land for which America wanted to expand. The founders were born British subjects. They knew what it meant to feel foreign in a world that was supposed to be their own. This oppression moved them to create a country suitable for people other than themselves. Ironically, The first president who didn't match these traits, who didn't have these traits, who was born within the official American borders, felt moved to remove people. Was it because of where he was born? Or was that just who he was? All we know is that he was entitled to the presidency because of where he was born. As far as the presidential clause was concerned, that's all that mattered. In 1862, Van Buren passed away in his home in rural New York. Some years before, he lost a re-election bid for a second presidential term. After that, he never really had a political career. He did live long enough to see 16 presidents take office, but there was one milestone he never saw: the 14th Amendment. In 1868, Congress passed the 14th Amendment that declared all persons born or naturalized in the United States are citizens of the United States. This amendment was deeply influenced by a proclamation made by another man. That man also fought through poverty to become president. That man, unlike Van Buren, resolutely proclaimed that any individual, regardless of race, should share in the American dream. And that man never lived to see the 14th Amendment either, although he arguably created it. That man was Abraham Lincoln. Unlike Martin Van Buren, everyone remembers him. So now you know the story of the first president born a United States citizen. And then I'm Paul Neihart, reminding you to be first when you should, last when you shouldn't. And I'll see you next time.